I was 3 minutes late boarding my flight to Hawaii when my daughter stopped me in the business class aisle and whispered, "Dad, you'll have to sit in the back. My husband's father needs your window seat more than you do." I looked at my father-in-law sitting comfortably in my assigned seat, sipping a drink like nothing had happened. After 40 years of sacrificing everything for my family, I picked up my bag and walked away. By the time that plane touched down in Hawaii, I had already begun making decisions they never saw coming. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to Dad Family Revenge. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your country, your city, even just your time zone. I read every single one. Some elements in this story are fictional, crafted for entertainment and education. Any resemblance to real people or places is coincidental, but what I'm sharing with you today matters. I've worked construction for 40 years. I know what 3 minutes means on a job site. 3 minutes is the difference between a wall going up clean or a crew standing around waiting for concrete that's already setting wrong. I never thought 3 minutes could do the same thing to a family. But that's exactly what happened on a Tuesday morning in December at Gate 14 of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, when my daughter pointed me to the back of the plane like I was luggage she'd forgotten to check. Let me back up. My name is Garrison Vance. Most people call me Garrett. I'm 68 years old, retired as of last spring, and I spent the better part of my adult life running a mid-size construction contracting business in North Carolina. I built things. Houses, office parks, a couple of schools. I built them with my hands first, then with my crews, then with my name on the paperwork. My wife Eleanor died 22 years ago, breast cancer, fast and cruel, and after that, I built one more thing, a life for my daughter Briar. I built it out of everything I had. Every dollar, every early morning, every Saturday I worked instead of resting. I don't say that looking for sympathy. I say it because you need to understand what I thought I was doing. I thought I was loving her. I didn't realize I was also teaching her that I had no limits worth respecting. This trip was my idea. 8 months of planning a 5-star resort in Maui, Hawaii for the whole family. Me, Briar, her husband, Chase Sterling, and his parents, Everett and Linda Sterling. My retirement gift to everyone. My way of saying, we made it, let's celebrate together. I'd saved carefully for this. Picked the flights myself. Requested seat 1A on the outbound leg business class window, left side of the aircraft. I'd never flown business class in my life. 68 years old, and I thought for once I deserved the good seat. I'd also booked the penthouse suite on the 18th floor, the best room the resort offered. 8 months of planning, and I had done every bit of it myself. I was 3 minutes late getting through security. The TSA scanner flagged my carry-on, an old steel thermos that apparently looked suspicious enough to warrant a manual search. I stood there with my arms out while a 20-something agent unpacked my bag item by item, my heart hammering, watching the clock on the wall tick past boarding time. By the time I got through, I was running. 68 years old, bad right knee from a fall off scaffolding in 2019, running through Terminal E with a rolling carry-on bouncing off my heels, breathing like I'd forgotten how. I made it to Gate 14 just before they closed the jetway door. The gate agent scanned my ticket, gave me a look that said she'd seen worse, and waved me through. I boarded, breathless. My shirt was damp at the collar. My knee was screaming. I turned left toward business class, counting rows, and I stopped. Seat 1A was occupied. Everett Sterling sat reclined in my window seat, a glass of pre-departure orange juice resting on his tray table, reading something on his phone, like a man who had been there for hours and intended to stay. He was wearing a blue blazer that probably cost more than my first truck. His silver hair was combed back perfectly. He didn't look up. Briar was standing in the aisle between rows 1 and 2. My daughter, 42 years old, wearing the expression I'd been seeing more and more of lately, not embarrassed, not apologetic, but arranged. Like she'd rehearsed this. "Dad." Her voice was low-controlled. "Everett's back has been acting up since the drive to the airport. He really needs the extra leg room and the window support. You understand?" She touched her own collarbone, a nervous gesture she'd had since childhood, then dropped her hand when she caught herself. "Your seat is 34C. It's actually convenient right by the restroom. So that works out." I stood there with my carry-on handle still gripped in my fist and looked at my daughter. My chest was tight, not just from running. Something deeper, something that had been tightening for a long time and had just pulled itself one notch further. "Convenient," I said. "Exactly." She smiled the smile she used with Chase's mother, bright and performative. "It all works out." I looked at Everett. He was still reading his phone. He hadn't acknowledged me, hadn't said thank you, hadn't offered to move, hadn't done anything that a man with basic decency would do when sitting in another man's assigned seat. He just sat there, orange juice at his elbow, like the whole thing was already settled. And maybe it was. Maybe Briar had told him, "Don't worry, Dad will understand." Dad always understands. My knee was throbbing. My heart rate was still too high. And my daughter was standing in the aisle of a business-class cabin, pointing me toward the back of the plane with the same casual ease she'd once used to ask me to move my truck out of her driveway because it embarrassed her in front of the neighbors. "Okay," I said. Just that. One word. I picked up my carry-on and walked down the aisle past row after row, all the way to 34C, middle seat, last section. Close enough to the lavatory that I could already smell the chemical sweetness of the air freshener they used to cover what the air freshener was covering. The man on my left was already asleep with his mouth open. The woman on my right was managing a toddler who was expressing his feelings about air travel loudly and with great commitment. I sat down. I put my bag in the overhead compartment. I buckled my seatbelt. Then I reached into my breast pocket and took out my boarding pass. Printed that morning. My name across the top, Garrison Vance. Seat number in the lower right corner, 1A. I folded it in half, then in half again. I put it back in my pocket. I've been on 100 job sites where something went wrong, materials, wrong measurements, wrong crew, wrong weather. The first thing you learn is that getting loud doesn't fix anything. You assess. You figure out exactly what failed and why. And then you decide whether you're patching it or tearing it down. I pressed my back against that narrow seat, looked at the overhead bin that wasn't quite fully closed above me, and listened to the boarding announcement playing for the third time. My knee hurt. My chest hurt. My pride hurt in a way I hadn't let myself name yet. 40 years of getting up before sunrise. 40 years of coming home with concrete dust in my hair and figures in my head. 40 years of making sure Briar had what she needed and what she wanted and what she didn't even know she wanted yet. And I'd just been told to sit by the bathroom. I looked at the fold in my boarding pass through my shirt pocket, just the corner of it showing. Seat 1A, Garrison Vance. I'd spent 4 decades building other people's foundations and never once asked if mine was still solid. Somewhere over the Carolinas, I started asking. The plane leveled out somewhere over Tennessee, and I was still staring at the seat pocket in front of me, like it owed me an explanation. 2 hours into the flight, the man on my left was still sleeping with his mouth open. The toddler on my right had exhausted himself into a sticky-faced nap against his mother's arm. The cabin had settled into that low, pressurized hum that either puts people to sleep or makes them think too much. I was firmly in the second camp. I was thinking about the look on Briar's face when she pointed me toward the back of the plane. Not her embarrassed face, I knew that one well. She'd worn it every time I showed up to something in my work truck. This was different. This was the face of someone who had already decided how things would go, and was mildly inconvenienced that I'd arrived late enough to require an explanation. That's when the flight attendant appeared. She was young, efficient, the kind of cheerful that comes from training rather than disposition. She stopped at 34C carrying a small white plate, the kind they used for pre-departure amuse-bouches in business class. On it sat half a dinner roll and a single pat of cold butter in a foil wrapper. "From the passenger in 1A, sir," she said, holding it out with a practiced smile. "She wanted to make sure you had something to eat." I looked at the plate. Half a roll. The cut end was already hardening at the edges. It had been sitting out a while. One pat of butter still cold, which meant it had come straight from the galley refrigerator, not warmed at the front of the cabin the way they did for business class passengers. Half a roll. Sent to the back of the plane, so Everett Sterling could watch my daughter take care of her father. My jaw tightened until I felt it in my back teeth. "That's very thoughtful," I said, keeping my voice easy. "But tell her I'm fine. I'll take care of myself." The flight attendant nodded and started to pull the plate back. Then I said, "Actually, could I see the menu I'd like to order?" She blinked. "Of course. You're in economy, so we have—" "I'm a full-fare passenger," I said. "I'll pay for whatever I order. What's available?" She went and came back with a laminated card. I ordered the Wagyu beef, a side of roasted vegetables, a glass of the Napa Cabernet they had listed, and a basket of warm bread. I handed over my personal visa, not the one linked to the family accounts, my own card, the one I'd carried since 1987, and used only for myself, which, until recently, had meant almost nothing, because I'd almost never spent anything on myself. While I waited, I thought about the half-roll. I thought about the year Briar turned 12 and decided she wanted a Schwinn 10-speed for Christmas, the cherry red one from the bike shop on Elm Street. The one that cost $340, which in 1994 was a significant portion of a 2-week paycheck. I worked 3 Saturday overtime shifts to cover it. I wrapped it myself, put a bow on it that was bigger than my hand. She rode it 4 times before deciding bikes weren't cool anymore. I thought about the summer she was 24, and her financial aid for her final semester fell through at the last minute. I sold Eleanor's pearl earrings, the ones I'd bought her for our 10th anniversary, the ones she'd worn on every important occasion of our marriage, to cover the shortfall. Briar never knew. I never told her. I thought that was the right thing to do at the time. I'm less sure about that now. The Wagyu arrived. It was excellent. Tender, properly seasoned, served with a little ramekin of compound butter that was room temperature and actually melted when it hit the beef. The Cabernet was better than anything I'd had in years. The bread was warm. I ate slowly, deliberately, with the full attention of a man who was starting to understand that he had been eating cold half-rolls for 40 years and calling it enough. When the flight attendant came to clear my tray, she leaned in slightly and said with genuine warmth, "That looked like it hit the spot. Best meal I've had in a long time." I told her and meant it. After she left, I took out my phone. My personal phone, not the family share plan. I opened the banking's app I'd barely used in years, the one tied only to my own accounts. The retirement fund, the savings I'd built brick by brick over 4 decades of early mornings. I looked at the balance for a long time. It was more than most people thought I had. I'd been quiet about money my whole life, the way men of my generation tended to be. You didn't discuss it, you just provided it. Then I opened the supplementary card management screen. 3 cards listed under my primary, 1 in Briar's name, 1 in Chase's name, 1 labeled Family Joint Use. 3 cards. Collectively, they'd been used for groceries, restaurant meals, car repairs, clothing, Chase's golf club membership, Briar's spa appointments, 2 of their last 3 vacations, and a leather sectional sofa I'd never sat on. I didn't cancel anything. Not yet. I just sat there at 34,000 feet looking at 30 years of one-way generosity laid out in a transaction history and let the number sink in. The toddler next to me stirred in his sleep, made a sound like a small engine turning over, and went quiet again. His mother shifted her arm to keep him from sliding without waking up herself. Even in sleep, she was adjusting for him. I recognized that. I put my phone away, looked out across the aisle at the small oval window on the far side of the cabin, a sliver of blue sky, nothing below it but cloud. Somewhere up ahead in seat 1A, Everett Sterling was probably ordering another orange juice. I pressed the call button above my seat. The flight attendant reappeared. "Yes, sir." "Another glass of that Cabernet," I said. "And whatever dessert you have." She smiled this time, it reached her eyes. "We have warm chocolate lava cake." "Perfect," I said. "I'll take it." I reclined my seat all 2 inches it offered and waited for my cake. Outside, the sky was getting brighter as we moved west, chasing the light. I had a long flight ahead of me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had nowhere I needed to be except exactly where I was. Hawaii hit me the moment the terminal doors slid open, warm air carrying plumeria and salt, the kind of smell that made you feel like the world had just exhaled. I stood there for a full 5 seconds with my carry-on at my feet, breathing it in, letting it settle into my chest. 8 months I'd been planning this trip. 8 months of comparing resort packages, reading reviews, calling the concierge desk to confirm ocean view arrangements. I'd imagined arriving here feeling something close to joy. Instead, I felt like a man who'd just finished reading a document he wished he'd read 20 years earlier. My private car was already waiting. I'd arranged it separately from the family's shuttle, a decision that had seemed merely practical when I made it 3 weeks ago, and felt almost prophetic now. The driver, a heavyset man named Roy, with a University of Hawaii bumper sticker on his dashboard and a cooler of cold water bottles in the back seat, glanced at me in the rearview mirror as we pulled onto the highway. "First time in Maui?" Roy asked. "First time anywhere like this," I said honestly. "Well," he said, grinning wide, "you picked a good week. Weather's been perfect." I looked out the window at the green hills rolling down toward the water and thought, yes, I did pick a good week. I picked every single thing about this trip. Every room, every restaurant reservation, every excursion. I picked it all, and I paid for it all, and somewhere in the family shuttle behind me, Chase Sterling was probably telling Everett about the resort's golf course, like he'd personally curated the whole experience. The penthouse was on the 18th floor, and when the bellman opened the door, I actually felt my breath catch. Floor-to-ceiling glass across the entire western face of the suite, nothing between me and the Pacific Ocean except 300 feet of open air and a balcony with 2 teak chairs facing the water. Fresh flowers on every surface, a fruit basket with a handwritten welcome card, a king bed with linens that probably cost more than my first car. I tipped the bellman $40 and stood alone at that window for a long time, hands in my pockets watching the sun begin its descent toward the water. Then my phone rang. Maeve Caldwell, the only person I'd told about any of this. Maeve and I had been friends for 31 years. We'd met on a job site outside Asheville. She was the project architect. I was the site foreman, and we'd spent 6 months arguing productively about load-bearing walls and drainage slopes before realizing we actually liked each other enormously. She'd been at Eleanor's funeral. She'd been at Briar's wedding, sitting in the back, because Briar had limited the guest list for intimacy reasons. And somehow Maeve, who had known Briar since she was 11 years old, hadn't made the cut for the front section. "Tell me everything," Maeve said before I could speak. So I did. I stood at that window overlooking the Pacific, and told her about the gate, the sprint through Terminal E. The look on Briar's face, Everett, in seat 1A with his orange juice, the half roll on the white plate, all of it. When I finished, Maeve was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, I counted, and then she said, "She didn't do this to hurt you, Garrett. She did it because she knew you'd absorb it." That's worse. My throat tightened so fast it surprised me. "Yeah," I managed. "I know. What are you going to do?" I walked to the balcony door, slid it open, stepped out into the warm, salt air. "I'm not going to ruin the trip," I said. "But I'm done being the one who pays for everyone else's version of it." "Good," Maeve said, and I could hear the relief in her voice, the relief of someone who had been waiting a long time to hear me say exactly that. "It's about time, you stubborn old man." I laughed, and the laugh came out rougher than I expected, catching somewhere in my chest. "I'm going to make a few changes." "Then make them," she said. "And Garrett, go enjoy every dollar you earned. You don't owe them a single sunrise." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the king bed with my phone in my hands and did what I should have done somewhere over the Pacific, instead of just staring at the numbers. I opened the supplementary card management portal. My bank's app was straightforward, the kind of interface built for people who actually managed their own accounts, and I worked through it methodically, the way I would have worked through a punch list on a job site. Briar's supplementary card canceled. Under federal banking law, as the primary account holder, I had the unilateral right to cancel any supplementary card at any time without notifying the cardholder. No court order, no family meeting, no argument required. Just a tap and a confirmation PIN. Chase's supplementary card canceled. The joint family card canceled. Then I called the resort's reservations line directly and removed Chase and Briar's names from the oceanfront villa booking. The reservation itself remained under my name, paid in full with my deposit. But the named guests had changed. I asked the reservations agent to flag the penthouse for biometric check-in, only using the thumbprint verification I'd set up when I'd made the original booking. "Of course, Mr. Vance," the agent said pleasantly. "Is there anything else we can help you with this evening?" "That'll do it," I said. "Thank you." I set my phone face down on the nightstand and walked back to the balcony. The sun was touching the water, now turning the whole ocean the color of hammered copper. In 40 years of construction work, I'd watched 1,000 sunsets from job sites, from the roofs of half-finished houses, from scaffolding, from parking lots, where I'd eaten my lunch alone because the crew had headed home and I was still running numbers. Every one of those sunsets had been beautiful. I just hadn't let myself notice. I pulled one of the teak chairs closer to the railing, sat down, and noticed this one. Somewhere below me, on the other side of this resort, a villa reservation was about to come up very empty. I didn't know exactly when Chase would reach the front desk, but I knew this: I'd spent 4 decades making sure everyone else had a soft place to land. Tonight, for the first time, the soft place was mine. I didn't have to wait long. From my balcony on the 18th floor, I could see a slice of the resort's open-air lobby below the sweeping thatched roof, the torchlit pathways, the fountain that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never had to clean one. I was finishing my second glass of water when I saw the Sterling family's shuttle van pull up to the main entrance. 4 figures climbed out. Even from 18 floors up, I recognized Chase's posture, shoulders, back, chin, up the walk of a man performing confidence for an audience he needed to impress. I went inside and picked up the house phone. "Front desk," said a cheerful voice. "How can I help you?" "I help you, Mr. Vance." "This is Garrett Vance in the penthouse," I said. "I want to let you know that if anyone attempts to charge anything to my suite number this evening, the answer is no. My room is flagged for personal charges only." "Absolutely, Mr. Vance. That's already noted in your reservation profile. Is there anything else?" "That's all. Thank you. I hung up, settled into the armchair by the window with my book, and waited. 22 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Chase. I watched his name light up the screen, felt my thumb hover over it, and set the phone face down on the side table. It buzzed again. Then a third time. Then Briar's name appeared, 2 rapid calls back to back, both sent to voicemail without a second thought. I turned a page. Down in the lobby, I imagined the scene unfolding with the precise, inevitable logic of a foundation crack that's been spreading for years and finally reaches the load-bearing wall. Chase approaching the front desk with that easy country club smile. The receptionist typing. The pause. The second look at the screen. The words that no man performing wealth in front of his father has ever wanted to hear. I found out later in pieces from a front desk manager named Patricia who handled the situation with professional grace and told me the details the following morning when I asked. Chase had walked up to the desk with Everett and Linda Sterling flanking him like a court in session. Linda Sterling, Everett's wife. A thin woman with highlighted hair and the particular kind of rigid posture that comes from decades of yoga and even more decades of social anxiety, had been touching the pearls at her throat and making appreciative sounds about the lobby decor. Chase Sterling. Chase had announced to the receptionist, the name landing like a reservation at a restaurant he expected to have a table waiting. We have a villa oceanfront, 3 bedrooms, the Hibiscus Suite. The receptionist had typed, paused, typed again. Mr. Sterling, I'm showing that reservation was modified earlier this afternoon. The named guests were updated, and the current reservation is single occupancy under the primary booking holder. Chase's smile had flickered just for a second, but Patricia saw it. I'm sorry, there must be some kind of system error. The reservation is under Garrison Vance, that's my father-in-law. He booked it for all of us. I understand, sir. However, the modification was made by the primary account holder directly, and it removed the additional named guests. The deposit on the original multi-guest booking was non-refundable under our standard policy, and since the booking was altered rather than canceled, no refund was issued. I'm very sorry for the inconvenience. Chase had laughed the wrong kind of laugh, too bright and too brief. Run it again. There's been a mistake. I've run it twice, sir. That was when Everett Sterling, standing to Chase's left, with the wounded dignity of a man who had never once in his life been told the table wasn't ready, cleared his throat and said, "Young lady, do you know who arranged this trip?" "I do, sir," Patricia said pleasantly. "Mr. Garrison Vance. And he's checked in and settled in his suite. Is there anything else I can help you with?" The silence that followed Patricia told me was the kind that had texture to it. Briar had appeared from somewhere. She'd been in the restroom when the conversation started, and she arrived to find Chase gripping the edge of the front desk with both hands, knuckles going white, jaw working like he was chewing something he couldn't swallow. "What happened?" Briar had asked, her voice rising at the edges with the particular pitch of someone who already knew, but needed a second to accept it. "Chase, what's going on?" "Call your father," Chase had said through his teeth, his voice dropping low and tight the way it did when he was furious and trying not to show it in public. "Right now. Call him." Briar had grabbed her phone, her hands trembling against the screen, her face going the color of old chalk. She'd called. Voicemail, called again, voicemail. The third time her composure cracked just enough that her voice broke when she said, "Dad, please call me back. There's been a please, just call me back." She'd looked up then, scanning the lobby with desperate eyes, and found me. I was standing at the edge of the lobby cafe, coffee cup in hand, having come down from the 18th floor for no other reason than that I wanted a proper espresso and the in-room machine made a reasonable but not excellent cup. I hadn't planned the timing. I hadn't staged it. But there I was, and there she was, and our eyes met across 40 feet of open-air lobby. I looked at my daughter's face, the mascara not quite run yet, but her eyes bright and glassy with tears that hadn't decided whether to fall, her lower lip pressed tight, the way it had been since she was 4 years old, and trying not to cry in front of people she wanted to impress. I held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then I raised my coffee cup slightly, not a wave, not a gesture of warmth, just an acknowledgement that I saw her, and I turned and walked to the private elevator bank, pressed the button for the 18th floor, and stepped in when the doors opened. I needed to be certain before I said a word to anyone. One sighting in a busy lobby was not enough. I would watch and I would wait, and when I was sure, I would act the same way. I had always handled anything that mattered. The last thing I saw before the elevator doors closed was Briar still standing by the front desk, one hand pressed flat against her sternum, like she was trying to hold something, and Chase's voice rising behind her as he demanded Patricia's manager. The elevator rose. I sipped my espresso. It was in fact excellent. I've never been a man who sleeps past 6. 40 years of 5 a.m. job sites rewire your internal clock in ways no vacation can fully undo. By 7:30 on that first morning in Maui, I was showered, dressed in a clean linen shirt and khakis, and standing on the penthouse balcony with a cup of coffee watching the resort come alive 18 floors below me. The grounds were stunning in the early light, gardeners moving quietly between the hibiscus beds, a pair of guests already claiming poolside chairs, with the focused determination of people who had done this before and knew the good spots went fast. The ocean beyond was flat and dark blue, the kind of color that made you feel like the world was still deciding what it wanted to be. I felt for the first time in longer than I could name genuinely rested. I rode the private elevator down at 8:15 and walked through the open-air corridor toward the beach path, intending nothing more than a slow morning walk along the waterline before the sun got serious. I had no agenda, no one to check on, no schedule built around someone else's preferences. The feeling was so unfamiliar, it almost felt wrong, and then it felt like exactly what 68 years of hard work had been building toward. I was halfway through the main lobby when I heard Briar's voice cut across the open space like a key scraping a lock. "Dad." She was moving toward me, fast heels clicking against the polished koa wood floor, wearing a sundress that probably cost more than my truck payment, and carrying the expression of a woman who had not slept well and had decided that was someone else's fault. Chase was 20 feet behind her, near the concierge desk, his jaw set tight, talking to someone on his phone, with the low, controlled fury of a man who was used to problems being solved by other people. Briar reached me and grabbed my arm, not gently. "What are you wearing?" she hissed, pulling me slightly sideways like she was trying to steer a piece of furniture. "Dad Everett is right over there. You look like you showed up to fix the air conditioning." My linen shirt was clean and pressed. My khakis had a crease in them. I was wearing the leather loafers Eleanor had picked out for me at a department store in Raleigh the Christmas before she got sick. Good shoes, well made, the kind that lasted. I looked at what I was wearing, and then I looked at my daughter's face, which was flushed pink at the cheekbones and tight around the eyes, with a desperation that had nothing to do with my wardrobe. "Good morning, Briar," I said. "Shh, don't good morning me," she snapped, her voice dropping to a furious whisper. "Everett asked me last night why you were put in a different car from the family. I told him you preferred it. Then he asked why your room was different from ours, and I told him you'd requested it specifically. Do you understand what I've been managing since we landed?" I tilted my head. "What did you tell him about the villa?" Her jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle flex in her cheek. I told him there was a booking error, that it was being sorted. She pressed one finger against her collarbone, that nervous habit again working overtime. I need you to go back upstairs and change into something that doesn't look like you drove here in a work van. Everett's family has a certain Briar. My voice came out quieter than I intended, which somehow made it land harder. Stop. She stopped. Her eyes went wide for just a second the way they had when she was small, and realized she'd pushed past a line she hadn't seen clearly until she'd already crossed it. That was when I looked past her shoulder, and everything else in the lobby fell away. Everett Sterling was standing near the concierge desk 20 feet away, talking to Linda with the easy posture of a man who considered himself the natural center of any room he occupied. He was wearing a pale blue polo and pressed slacks, his silver hair catching the morning light. And on his left wrist, catching that same light with a particular familiar gleam, was a watch. A Rolex Datejust, stainless steel. The face the color of old silver, the bezel unadorned. I'd know that watch from 100 yards. I'd bought it in 1987 from a jeweler on Trade Street in Charlotte, saved for 11 months to afford it, had it engraved on the caseback E+G 1987, and clasped it around Eleanor's wrist on our 10th wedding anniversary, while she laughed and told me I was being ridiculous, and then cried a little, and told me she loved it more than anything I'd ever given her. After Eleanor died, I'd kept it in a velvet box in my nightstand drawer for 19 years. I'd taken it out exactly twice, once when Briar graduated college, once when she got married, and worn it myself both times, because I wanted Eleanor in the room for those moments. I'd brought it on this trip for the same reason. Last I'd seen it, it was on my bedside table in the penthouse when I'd gone to shower yesterday afternoon. Briar had a backup key card to my room. I'd given it to her 6 months ago, when I had a minor health scare, and she'd insisted on being listed as my emergency contact. I stood in the lobby of a Maui resort and watched Everett Sterling rotate my dead wife's watch on his wrist like it was a new accessory he was deciding whether he liked. My chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. Something in me went very still, the way a job site goes still in the seconds after something structural gives way, before anyone has started shouting yet. Dad. Briar's voice came from somewhere slightly outside my focus. Are you even listening to me? I need you to go change before. I heard you, I said. I looked at her. Her eyes were searching my face with that particular anxious scanning she did when she couldn't read me, which had always been her least comfortable place to be. I wanted to ask her directly. I wanted to say, did you take it or did you give it to him? Did you reach into my nightstand and hand your mother's watch to a man who thinks construction is a punchline? But I didn't. Not here. Not in this lobby with Chase on his phone and Everett 15 feet away adjusting his cuffs. I had learned over 68 years that the questions that matter most deserve to be asked in the right place and at the right time. This lobby was neither. I'm going for a walk, I said to Briar, keeping my voice level even though something behind my sternum was pulling so tight it nearly took my breath. Have a good morning. I stepped around her and kept walking toward the beach path. She called after me, Dad, we're not done talking. And I raised one hand slightly in acknowledgement without turning back, which I knew would frustrate her more than any argument could. The beach path was lined with plumeria trees. I walked until I couldn't hear the lobby sounds anymore, until it was just the ocean and the wind and the occasional call of something in the trees I couldn't identify. Then I stopped, put my hands in my pockets, and looked out at the water. I'll get you back, Elle, I said quietly to nobody, to the ocean, to wherever she was. I promise. Then I turned around and walked back to the resort. Not to the beach. Back inside to the concierge desk, and I had a very specific conversation that I'd been building towards since the moment I saw that watch catch the light. I spent the rest of that morning at the concierge desk, then with the resort's head of security, a calm, efficient man named Dennis, who had clearly handled delicate guest situations before and didn't require a great deal of explanation to understand what I was describing. "I need to file a lost property report," I told him. A Rolex Datejust stainless steel case silver dial oyster bracelet, engraved on the case back E+G 1987. It was on my bedside table in the penthouse yesterday afternoon. Dennis wrote it down without blinking. "Do you have any idea where it might have gone, Mr. Vance?" "I have a strong suspicion," I said. "There's a guest currently wearing a watch that matches that description exactly. He's in the resort right now. I'd rather not make a scene in the lobby, but I'd appreciate it if the item were flagged at all resort exit points." Dennis looked at me steadily. "Consider it done, sir. We'll be discreet." That handled, I spent the afternoon the way I'd planned to spend every afternoon on this trip, before everything went sideways slowly. I walked the beach for an hour. I sat in a shaded chair near the waterline and watched pelicans work the surf. I ate a late lunch of fish tacos from the casual beachside grill, paid cash, tipped 30%, and felt more like myself than I had in years. By the time evening came, I was back in the penthouse, changed for dinner, heading down to the resort's quieter beachfront restaurant, the one I'd specifically reserved for myself on nights I wanted to eat without managing anyone else's mood. I was 3 courses into a genuinely excellent meal, seared ahi, a glass of Sonoma Pinot bread that arrived warm every time without my asking when my phone rang. Linda Sterling. I frowned at the screen. Linda and I had spoken perhaps a dozen times in the 7 years since Briar married Chase, and every one of those conversations had been initiated by logistics, holiday planning, gift coordination. The occasional family schedule conflict that Briar had routed through her mother-in-law for reasons I'd never fully understood. Linda calling me directly on a Tuesday evening in Maui meant something had gone wrong enough that the normal chain of communication had broken down entirely. I answered, "Garrison." Her voice was stretched thin, the careful diction of a woman raised to maintain composure fraying at the edges like old upholstery. "I hope I'm not interrupting your evening." "Not at all, Linda. What can I do for you?" "Well..." A pause. I heard restaurant sounds behind her voices, the clink of glassware, and then her voice dropped to the slightly hushed register of someone who did not want to be overheard. "There seems to have been some confusion with the billing this evening at the Hana restaurant. Chase attempted to arrange the charges through your suite account, as he understood that was the arrangement for the trip, and the server came back and said..." Another pause, longer this time, waited with the particular embarrassment of a woman who had never in her life expected to narrate this kind of scene. "Well, she said the account had been restricted, and then she said it again after Chase asked her to try a second time." I set down my fork. "I see. Chase is handling it," Linda said quickly, her voice climbing slightly. "He has his own cards, of course, it's not..." She stopped, restarted. "Garrison, I just wanted to make sure there hadn't been some kind of bank error. You know how these things happen when you're traveling internationally." "Linda," I said, keeping my voice as warm and even as I could manage, "there was no bank error." The silence on her end had a very specific quality to it. The quality of a woman recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the evening and possibly about the last 7 years. "Oh," she said finally, in a very small voice. "Is everyone all right over there?" I asked. "Yes, she cleared her throat. "Yes, fine. I'm sorry to have bothered you, Garrison." "Not at all. Good night, Linda." I hung up and sat back in my chair, looking out at the dark water beyond the restaurant's open terrace. The Pinot was excellent. I finished my glass and ordered a second. I learned the rest of the details the following morning because Briar, unable to contain herself, came to find me at breakfast and told me everything in a furious, hissing whisper that was clearly meant to make me feel guilty, and instead gave me a fairly complete picture of the previous evening's events. The bill at the Hana restaurant had come to $1,847. Chase had ordered the Wagyu, the whole Maine lobster, a tasting flight of Japanese whiskey for Everett, and a bottle of Burgundy that the sommelier had clearly talked him into by describing it as the kind of wine people remember. When the server returned with the news that the Vance suite account was restricted for third-party charges, Chase had laughed the sharp, too loud laugh that Briar said always meant he was panicking and asked her to run it again. She ran it twice. Briar told me, her voice vibrating with something between fury and humiliation as she leaned across the breakfast table toward me. "Dad." She said it twice right there in front of Everett, in front of his mother. "That must have been uncomfortable," I said, buttering my toast with genuine attention. "Uncomfortable." Briar's eyes went glassy with frustrated tears that she was absolutely refusing to let fall. "Chase had to put it on his personal card. His personal card, Dad, and the first one was declined." I looked up from my toast. "Which one went through?" She pressed her lips together so hard they went pale. "The second one." But there was a moment. She stopped, squeezed her eyes shut briefly, then opened them again, blazing. "Everett saw the whole thing. He didn't say anything at dinner, but on the way back to the room, he told Chase that a man who can't cover a dinner check shouldn't be ordering the Burgundy." I set my toast down. "Dad!" Briar's voice cracked on the word, and the tears finally spilled, one from each eye, tracking down her cheeks. In thin lines, she immediately pressed away with her fingertips, jaw clenched, furious at herself for cracking in front of me. "Why are you doing this? We came here as a family. You planned this trip. You invited all of us." "I did," I said. "Then why, Briar?" I folded my hands on the table and looked at my daughter. Her red-rimmed eyes, her rigid shoulders, the desperate confusion of someone who had built an entire architecture of assumptions and was only now feeling the foundation shift. "I planned this trip for a family that treated me like one. I'm still here. I'm still on vacation. I'm eating my breakfast, and it's a beautiful morning, and I have a walk on the beach planned for 9 o'clock. I picked my toast back up. "The only thing that's changed is who's paying for what." She stared at me. Her chin was trembling now, the tears coming faster than she could press them away. "So that's it." Her voice came out broken and raw. "That's all I get, Dad. I'm your daughter." "You are," I said. "And I love you." Those two things are both completely true. I met her eyes. "And neither one of them means what you've decided they mean." She pushed back from the table and walked away, fast, head down, one hand covering her mouth. I watched her go with a chest that ached down to the bone because I meant every word, including the last part, and meaning it didn't make it hurt any less. I finished my breakfast. Then I went for my walk. I got back to the penthouse at 9:15, my shoes still damp from the waterline, my heart still carrying the weight of Briar's face as she walked away from the breakfast table. The walk hadn't cleared my head the way I'd hoped. It had just given me more space to feel the full size of everything. I was pouring a glass of water from the in-room carafe when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Maeve. A text message, no greeting, just 4 words and an image attachment. "You need to see this." I set down the glass and opened the photo. It was a screenshot of our family group chat, the one Briar had created 2 years ago, and named Vance Sterling Fam, the one I checked approximately once a month and mostly used to confirm holiday dinner times. The message at the top of the screenshot was from Briar, time-stamped 40 minutes ago, and it read, "Once we're at the yacht, make sure Dad is not in the photos. He'll ruin the aesthetic. I told the concierge he's resting. Can we get him moved to the garden view rooms without him realizing the oceanfront backdrop won't work with him in frame?" I read it once. Then I read it again slower, the way I used to reread a contract clause when something felt wrong, but I couldn't immediately identify what. He'll ruin the aesthetic. My phone buzzed again. Maeve. She sent it to the whole group. "You're in that chat, Garrett. She doesn't know you saw it yet." Then, "Say the word and I'll be there in 10 minutes. I walked to the balcony door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the morning air. The ocean was brilliant and flat in the mid-morning light, the kind of blue that looked painted. I gripped the railing with both hands and breathed slowly, deliberately, the way my doctor had told me to when my blood pressure started climbing 2 years ago after a particularly brutal contract dispute. My thumb hovered over Maeve's messages for a long moment. Then I typed, "I'm okay." Her response came back in under 10 seconds. "You are absolutely not okay, but you will be. Don't do anything yet." I almost laughed at that. Maeve had known me long enough to understand that my version of doing something and most people's version were categorically different. I didn't throw things. I didn't shout. I built cases. I gathered materials. I waited for the right conditions. Then I worked. I went back inside, sat at the desk in the corner of the suite, and opened the group chat on my own phone. There it was, Briar's message sitting in the thread above a gif of a sunset that Linda had sent 3 days ago, and a reminder from Chase about the Marina shuttle time. Nobody else had responded to Briar's message. Either they hadn't seen it yet, or they were pretending they hadn't, which amounted to the same thing. I took a screenshot, saved it to a new folder I created on the spot, and labeled simply Hawaii. Then I called Maeve. She picked up on the first ring, and I could hear outdoor sounds behind her wind-distant traffic, the particular ambient hum of somewhere that wasn't a resort. "Where are you?" I asked. "Farmer's market in Paya," she said. "I'm buying papaya and trying not to call Briar myself, which is taking considerable self-control." A pause. "How are you really?" I looked at the screenshot still open on my phone. My daughter's words arranged in a neat blue text bubble, clinical and casual. At the same time, the way you talked about furniture you were considering returning. "He'll ruin the aesthetic." "You know what the worst part is," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "It's not that she said it. It's that she didn't hesitate. You don't write something like that without having thought it first." "No," Maeve agreed quietly. "You don't. See, I've been editing myself for 40 years, I said, and felt something crack open in my chest. As I said it, a hairline fracture that had been there a long time, splitting now under the specific pressure of a Tuesday morning in Hawaii. Every job site dinner where I didn't bring her because I thought she'd be bored. Every time I left early from something at Chase's family because I could feel her getting embarrassed. Every photo I stepped out of because she gave me a look. My throat tightened until the words had to push through. I was doing her a favor, Maeve. I thought I was being considerate. Garrett. Maeve's voice was steady and warm and absolutely no nonsense. You were teaching her there that you were optional. There's a difference. That landed somewhere deep and stayed there. I know, I said. What are you going to do about the yacht? I leaned back in the desk chair and looked at the ceiling, the clean white expanse of it, the recessed lighting. I'd booked that private charter 6 months ago, the evening before Christmas, sitting at my kitchen table in Charlotte with a glass of bourbon and the resort's activity catalog. I'd specifically chosen the sunset sail because I remembered Eleanor telling me once that her favorite thing in the world was watching the sun go down over open water. I'd wanted to do it for her, do it in her memory, surrounded by family. That plan had required a certain version of my family that apparently didn't exist. "I'm going to call the marina," I said, "and I'm going to make a small adjustment to the guest list." Maeve's voice warmed with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific sentence. "Good. One guest," I said. "Just me." "Perfect," she said. "And Garrett, take the champagne. You've earned every bubble." After we hung up, I pulled up the marina's contact number from my reservation confirmation email and dialed. A cheerful young man named Brandon answered, confirmed my booking for the following afternoon's private charter, and made the guest list adjustment without question or commentary. "Updated to single occupancy, Mr. Vance," Brandon said. "Anything else we can do for you?" "That'll do it," I said. "Thank you, Brandon." I set the phone down, opened my laptop, and pulled up the yacht charter confirmation. One guest. My name. The departure time was 4:30 tomorrow, which gave the Pacific exactly the right angle to do something spectacular with the light. I printed the confirmation on the in-room printer, folded it, and put it in the breast pocket of my linen shirt, right next to where I'd been carrying my original boarding pass since Tuesday morning. 2 documents in the same pocket, both with my name on them, both meaning something entirely different than they had when I'd first held them. Outside, the ocean kept moving the way oceans do, indifferent, magnificent, completely uninterested in the small human dramas arranged along its edges. I watched it for a while from the balcony and felt beneath the ache in my chest something that was not quite peace yet, but was pointed in that direction. Tomorrow afternoon, I would have it to myself, every horizon of it. The marina was a 20-minute shuttle ride from the resort, winding down through a stretch of highway where the sugarcane fields opened up on one side and the ocean appeared on the other in sudden, breathtaking flashes between the hillside trees. I took the 3:15 shuttle an hour earlier than I needed to because I wanted time to settle in before anyone else arrived at the dock. Brandon turned out to be exactly as cheerful in person as he'd sounded on the phone, a kid in his mid-20s with sun-bleached hair and the easy competence of someone who'd grown up around boats. He shook my hand at the dock and walked me out to the charter with the particular pride of a young man who genuinely loved his work. "She's a 42-footer," Brandon said, stepping aboard and gesturing around the deck with the enthusiasm of a man showing off his own living room. "We've got champagne chilling in the galley, some local cheese and fruit, and the captain knows the best angle to catch the sunset from the northwest. You're going to love it, Mr. Vance." "I already do," I told him, and meant it completely. The boat was beautiful, clean white fiberglass teak decking warm under my shoes, a cushioned seating area on the stern that faced directly west. I settled in with my glass of champagne, cold, dry, faintly toasty, the kind of thing you could spend a whole evening with, and opened the book I'd been carrying since Charlotte, and still hadn't found a quiet enough moment to read. I found one now. I was 3 pages in when I heard them. Voices from the dock, maybe 50 yards back, the particular pitch of a group that had expected to arrive somewhere and found the situation different than anticipated. I recognized Briar's voice first, then Chase's, then Everett's, carrying over the others with the carrying power of a man accustomed to filling rooms. I didn't turn around. I turned a page. Brandon's voice reached me next, patient and apologetic. "I understand, ma'am, but the charter is booked for a single guest. It was updated this morning. I'm not able to add additional passengers to a private booking without the primary guest's authorization." The primary guest is my father. Briar's voice cracked on the last word, and even from 50 yards and over the sound of the water, I could hear the specific fracture in it. Not tears, not yet, but the edge where composure ended and something raw began. He booked this for the whole family. There's obviously been a mistake. There's no mistake, ma'am, Brandon said gently. The reservation was modified at 9:53 this morning. Single occupancy. I made the change myself. A pause. Then chase lower and tighter. Who authorized the modification? The primary account holder, sir. Another pause longer this time with a texture I recognized even from a distance. The texture of people doing arithmetic they didn't want to finish. I raised my champagne glass and took a slow sip watching a pelican work the water 30 feet off the port side, that ancient, unhurried diving pattern patient as geology. Can you at least go ask him? Briar's voice again, and this time the crack had widened into something that made my chest pull tight despite everything. She was my daughter. That part didn't switch off. It just had to coexist with everything else. Please, just go ask him if we can come aboard. I heard Brandon's footsteps on the dock, then on the gangplank, then quiet. He appeared at the stern, hands in his pockets, expression professionally neutral, with just a trace of genuine sympathy underneath it. Mr. Vance, he said, your family is at the dock. They're asking if they can join you. I wanted to check with you directly before I gave them an answer either way. I looked at him. He was a good kid, you could tell from the way he asked, from the fact that he'd come to ask at all, rather than just relaying a policy. I appreciated that. Tell them I hope they enjoy the public tour from Pier 7, I said. It departs at 5 o'clock. The views are excellent from what I understand. Brandon held my gaze for exactly 1 second, and I saw something move in his eyes, some quick private processing of the situation, before he nodded, once said, yes, sir, and walked back down the gangplank to the dock. I turned back to my book. I heard him relay the message. I heard Briar make a sound that wasn't a word, a sharp, wounded exhale that carried across the water with a clarity that made me grip my champagne glass tighter than I meant to. I heard Everett say something in a low voice that I couldn't make out but didn't need to. I heard Chase say, come on, in the flat, defeated tone of a man who had run out of angles. The captain, a weathered man in his 50s named Ray, who'd introduced himself with a firm handshake and a sun-squinted smile, appeared from the wheelhouse and gave me a look of mild, professional curiosity. Ready when you are, Mr. Vance, he said. Let's go, Ray, I said. The engine turned over with a deep, satisfying rumble. The lines came off the cleats. The boat eased away from the dock with the smooth deliberateness of something that knew exactly where it was going. I did not look back at the dock. But in the moment before we cleared the breakwater, before the engine noise rose and the distance became too great, I heard Briar's voice one last time calling my name just once, the way she used to call it, when she was small and had woken from a nightmare and needed to know I was still there. Dad. The word hit me somewhere between the ribs and stayed there aching like a bruise on a bone. I pressed my free hand flat against my chest for a moment, just a moment, and breathed. Then I looked west, where the sky was beginning to turn colors that had no adequate names, and I let Ray take us out into all that open, golden, indifferent water. An hour later, with the sun balanced on the horizon like something impossibly precious about to slip away, I set down my book. I'd made it 12 pages, a personal record for this trip, and just watched. The champagne was gone. The cheese and fruit had been excellent. The pelican, or possibly a different pelican, was still working the water off the port side. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the way she used to reach over in the car without saying anything and put her hand on my arm when she could tell I was carrying something heavy. I thought about how I hadn't let anyone do that in 22 years, because I'd decided the carrying was mine to do alone. Maybe that had been the first mistake. Way before the plane. Way before Briar. Ray appeared from the wheelhouse with a second glass of champagne. I hadn't asked for it. He'd just brought it the way good captains apparently did, and set it on the rail beside me. "Beautiful evening," he said. "Best one I've had in years," I told him honestly. He nodded once, the satisfied nod of a man who had seen enough sunsets to know which ones were special, and went back to his wheelhouse. I picked up the champagne, raised it slightly toward the horizon, toward Eleanor, toward whatever was out there beyond the edge of the water, and said quietly enough that only the ocean could hear, "I hear you, Elle. I finally hear you." Before I tell you what I found on Everett Sterling's wrist that evening, something that made my blood run cold and my hands go completely still, I need to know if you're still with me. If this story is hitting close to home, drop a 1 in the comments right now. Just a 1. That's all I need to know you're here. Because what's coming next? I don't think many of you will see it coming. And a quick note, the story ahead contains some fictional elements woven in to bring the deeper truth to life. If that's not your kind of content, no judgment at all, this is a good place to step away. But if you're staying, hold on tight. It's about to get very real. Ray brought the boat back to the dock at 7:15, just as twilight drained from the western sky. I stepped off the gangplank lighter than I had felt in years, carrying the rare contentment of a man who had spent 2 solitary hours on the ocean. I tipped, Ray shook Brandon's hand, rode the shuttle up the hill, and watched sugarcane fields blur past in the gathering dark. Cutting through the resort's open-air corridor toward the elevator bank, I stopped dead. Everett Sterling stood inside the gift shop inspecting a carved koa wood bowl. Over his polo, he wore a pale linen jacket, his left wrist resting casually against the glass display case. Caught beneath the overhead lights, that familiar silver date just gleamed unchanged across 38 years. My heart hammered hard against my ribs. I forced myself to breathe slowly before stepping into a quiet alcove to call Dennis. "Mr. Vance." Dennis answered on the second ring. "Dennis, the Rolex I reported this morning is currently in the gift shop," I said quietly. "On Everett Sterling's left wrist." "I'm on my way," Dennis replied. 3 minutes." I waited against the wall, trapped between grief and anger. Eleanor had worn that watch to our anniversary dinners in the delivery room when Briar was born, and on the final quiet morning she had felt well enough to dress. Inside the boutique, Dennis's calm voice challenged Everett, whose tone rose in sharp protest. "Why, this was a gift from my daughter-in-law," Everett snapped. "Sir," Dennis said firmly, "the registered guest filed a report with exact serial numbers and an engraving E+G 1987. We must hold disputed items pending verification." A tense silence fell before Everett yielded with cold, clipped compliance. Moments later, they emerged into the corridor. Everett spotted me, his face shifting from startled annoyance to calculated restraint. "Garrison Vance." He began, his voice taut with wounded pride. "Briar gave me this as a family gesture. You're creating a scene over an unfortunate misunderstanding." "I know how it reached you, Everett," I said evenly. "Dennis will secure it tonight, and I will collect it tomorrow morning." The muscle in Everett's jaw pulsed visibly. "It was an innocent mistake. That watch belonged to Eleanor," I replied, holding his gaze with absolute resolve. "She wore it for decades. She died in it. It is not a misunderstanding." Everett held my stare for a taut second, before looking aside, conceding defeat against a wall he could not charm away. He turned and strode briskly toward the lobby. "All set, Mr. Vance," Dennis said. "Pick it up at 8 tomorrow." "Thank you, Dennis." I shook his hand. I stepped into the elevator, pressed 18, and felt the quiet hum as the car ascended. I touched the folded boarding pass in my pocket, thinking of Eleanor laughing across candlelight in Charlotte when I first gave her the watch, and she wiped away happy tears. Tomorrow I would finally wear it on the long flight back home. I had been in bed for exactly 23 minutes when the knocking started. Not a tentative knock. Not the polite two-tap of someone who understood that 10 o'clock at night was late and felt accordingly apologetic about it. This was the sustained, flat-palmed knock of someone who had decided that whatever was on the other side of the door owed them entry, and was communicating that belief through the door itself. I lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. Then I pushed back the covers, found my slippers, and went to the door. I looked through the peephole. Briar stood in the hallway in a silk robe she'd bought specifically for this trip, I knew, because she'd shown it to me over video call 2 months ago and said it was resort appropriate, which I'd taken to mean expensive. Her hair was down, her makeup was gone, and her face was doing the particular tight-jawed thing it did when she had decided she was in the right about something and was prepared to hold that position indefinitely. I opened the door. She pushed past me into the suite without waiting to be invited, a habit she'd had since adolescence that I had never adequately addressed, and which I was now noting with the clarity of a man who had recently begun keeping better records. "Dad." She spun to face me, arms crossed over her chest, chin up. "We need to talk about Everett." "It's 10 o'clock, Briar. I know what time it is." Her voice was sharp as new wire. "Dennis from security showed up at his door tonight and made him hand over a watch that I gave him as a gift, in front of Linda. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was for him? For all of us?" I walked to the entry table where the resort had placed a standard amenity setup: ice bucket, tongs, a carafe of water, 2 glasses. The ice bucket was full. They restocked it every evening. "You gave him your mother's watch," I said. "I gave him a watch from your drawer that you never wear." "From my drawer," I said. "That you accessed with the backup key card I gave you for emergencies." Her jaw tightened, and for just a second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not quite guilt, but its younger sibling, the one that showed up before guilt fully arrived and tried to argue its way out. I thought it would mean something to him. It was a nice gesture, a family gesture. "It wasn't yours to gesture with," she pressed on, her voice climbing. "That is not the point right now. The point is that you need to call Dennis in the morning and tell him it was a misunderstanding and have that watch returned to Everett. And..." She paused, pulling her shoulders back, squaring up the way she did when she was about to say the harder thing. "And I need you to move to a standard room for the rest of the trip. Everett and Linda deserve the suite. Their room doesn't have a soaking tub, and Linda's back has been..." Briar. My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, which was becoming a pattern this week. She kept going. "It's 4 more days, Dad. It's not a big deal. You'll barely notice the difference between the penthouse and a standard..." "Stop." The word landed between us with enough weight that she actually did. I looked at my daughter, standing in my suite at 10 o'clock at night, in her resort robe, asking me to give up the room I'd booked and paid for, so that the man currently wearing my dead wife's watch could have a soaking tub. Something in my chest that had been under pressure for 2 days made a sound I could feel more than hear, not quite a break, more like a release valve finding its limit. I walked to the entry table and set the ice bucket down quietly. Then I turned back to face her. "Briar." My voice came out low and final, the way it did on a job site when a decision had been made. and there was nothing left to discuss. I'm not moving rooms. I'm not returning the watch. And I'm done having this conversation tonight. She opened her mouth, the argument already forming the pressure of it visible in her jaw, her shoulders, her hands, and I held up one hand. Not sharp, not angry, just stop. Good night, Briar, I said, and I closed the door. Not slammed, closed. Firmly, deliberately, with the particular finality of a man who had made a decision and was at peace with it. I heard the latch click into place and stood with my hand still on the door handle for a moment, listening to the sounds from the hallway. Briar's voice, high and furious, saying things I couldn't make out through the door and didn't need to. Then footsteps quick and receding, heading for the elevator. I took my hand off the door handle. My heart was beating faster than usual, not from anger, but from the particular physiological response to doing something you have never done before in 68 years of life. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I went back to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed both palms flat on my knees and breathed for a moment. The room was very quiet. Through the glass doors to the balcony, I could see the dark ocean and the stars above it, and the lights of what might have been a distant ship, or might have been a star sitting low on the horizon. It was impossible to tell from here. 42 years, I thought. She is 42 years old, and that is the first time in her life I have closed a door on her. What does it say about the preceding 42 years that closing a door felt like the bravest thing I had done all decade? I sat with that question for a while. It didn't have a comfortable answer, so I let it be uncomfortable and sat with it anyway. The way you sit with a sore joint, acknowledging it, not pretending it isn't there, waiting for it to tell you something useful. Eventually, I lay back down, pulled the covers up. The ocean outside was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous, and somewhere below me, Briar was either telling Chase what had just happened, or standing in an elevator pressing the button for her floor, with more force than was strictly necessary. Either way, she was 68 years old, minus 26, fully capable, and dealing with consequences that were, for the first time in both our lives, actually proportionate to their cause. I closed my eyes, and for the second night in a row, I slept. I was on my second cup of coffee, sitting at the balcony table with the morning paper, an actual print edition that the resort left outside suite doors every morning, a detail I'd appreciated enough to mention to the front desk when my phone showed a missed call from an unfamiliar extension, followed immediately by a voicemail notification. I set down my coffee and played it. A woman's voice, professionally warm, the practiced hospitality tone of someone whose job required delivering awkward news pleasantly. Good morning, Mr. Vance. This is Teresa calling from the Hale Maca Spa. We have a treatment booking this morning for a Mrs. Linda Sterling that was submitted for billing to your suite. We weren't able to process the charge, and we do need a valid payment method on file before we can continue with the service. If you could give us a call at your earliest convenience, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and have a beautiful day. I listened to it twice. Then I set the phone face up on the table, picked up my coffee, and looked out at the ocean, which was doing its reliable morning thing, blue, enormous, entirely unconcerned with the Sterling family's spa situation. Chase had tried to book a $2,000 spa package for his mother and charge it to my room while I was sleeping. The particular audacity of that specific move, the timing of it, the assumption of it, landed somewhere in my chest, not as anger, but as a kind of exhausted clarity, the feeling you got when a pattern you'd been half-seeing for years finally resolved itself into full focus. I called Teresa back. She answered on the first ring, her voice lifting with relief. Mr. Vance, thank you so much for calling back. Morning, Teresa, I said. The treatment on my suite, I didn't authorize it. I won't be authorizing it. A brief, carefully neutral pause. Of course, Mr. Vance. I completely understand. We do have Mrs. Sterling currently in the middle of her seaweed wrap treatment. Our policy requires a valid payment method before we can continue. That's your policy, I said. I'm not in a position to help with that. Of course. We'll reach out to the booking party directly. I'm sorry for any inconvenience. None at all, I said. You did exactly the right thing by calling. I hung up, refilled my coffee from the in-room carafe, and went back to the paper. Page 6 had a piece about a marine conservation project off the Maui coast that I found genuinely interesting. I read it twice. 40 minutes later, I was at the poolside cafe ordering a second breakfast. The resort's eggs Benedict were exceptional, and I had decided that vacation meant ordering eggs Benedict whenever I wanted when I spotted Chase across the pool deck. He was pacing the length of the far side with his phone pressed against his ear, his other hand cutting through the air in the sharp, frustrated gestures of a man who was having a conversation that wasn't going the way he needed it to go. His shirt was untucked on one side. His hair, usually arranged with the careful carelessness of someone who spent considerable time on it, had a section at the back that was sticking up in a way he clearly hadn't noticed. His face was the color of a man who had been making calls for the better part of an hour and hitting walls on every one of them. I watched him for a moment over my coffee cup. Not with satisfaction, I want to be clear about that, because satisfaction would have required me to feel something smaller than what I actually felt, which was a bone-deep weariness, all the architecture of pretense that had been constructed over the years, and was now piece by piece showing its actual load-bearing capacity. Chase ended one call and immediately started another, turning away from the pool and dropping his voice. I could see his shoulders pull tight as whoever was on the other end answered, and then the specific forward tilt of his head that meant he was asking for something he wasn't sure he'd get. He was calling in favors, trying to borrow money from friends to cover a $2,000 spa bill for his mother while on a Hawaiian vacation he hadn't paid for. I thought about the family dinners where Chase had talked about his investment portfolio, about the Christmas cards he and Briar sent every year with a photo taken in front of a house that had my name on the deed. My eggs Benedict arrived. They were as advertised exceptional. I called Maeve. She answered with the sound of wind behind her. She was outside somewhere again, which seemed to be her natural state. How's paradise? Complicated, I said. Chase tried to charge a $2,000 spa package to my room while I was asleep. A beat. Then, while you were asleep. While I was asleep. The confidence of that man. Maeve said, her voice carrying the specific tone of someone who was genuinely impressed against their better judgment. It's almost admirable, in the way that a very aggressive fungus is almost admirable. I laughed, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere lower than my chest. He's currently across the pool deck trying to borrow money from someone to cover the bill. Can he see you? Not unless he turns around. Good. Maeve's voice warmed. Eat your breakfast, Garrett. Eat the whole thing. What are you having? Eggs Benedict. Perfect. How are the eggs? Exceptional. Then focus on those, she said. The rest of it will take care of itself. I looked across the pool deck. Chase had ended his second call and was staring at his phone screen with the hollow, recalculating expression of a man who was running out of options and beginning to understand that the floor he'd been standing on had never been as solid as he'd assumed. His shoulders had dropped from their usual squared-back position into something more genuine and considerably more defeated. Linda Sterling emerged from the spa corridor 45 minutes after that, according to the timeline I pieced together later. Her hair was half set in the rollers they'd put in before the seaweed wrapped the rest of it loose and damp. Her face had visible streaks of the clay mask that hadn't been fully rinsed before the treatment was stopped. She was wearing a robe that belonged to the spa, and carrying her clothes in a tote bag because she hadn't had time to change. Chase met her at the corridor entrance. I was still at the poolside cafe, and I could see them from where I sat, Linda's expression, which was attempting dignity and achieving only a rigid kind of shock, and Chase beside her, speaking in the low, urgent voice of a man doing damage control. Linda looked across the pool deck toward the cafe. Our eyes met. Her chin came up slightly, the reflex of a woman who had been raised to maintain composure, and then she looked away. I left a 30% tip for the cafe server, folded my newspaper under my arm, and went to find a good chair on the beach. I had a book that wasn't going to read itself, a morning that belonged entirely to me, and somewhere on the other side of this resort. Everett Sterling was about to have a conversation with a man who had run out of borrowed floors to stand on. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I found a good beach chair that morning and stayed in it for 3 hours, which was 3 hours longer than I'd sat in a beach chair in the preceding decade. I read 40 pages of my book. I ordered a shave ice from a passing cart, pineapple and coconut, the combination the cart operator recommended with the evangelical conviction of a man who had thought about it seriously, and ate it slowly while a pair of sea turtles moved through the shallows 20 feet from where I sat, unhurried and ancient and magnificently indifferent to everything happening on the shore. By 2 in the afternoon, I had relocated to the resort's upper terrace, a quieter space above the main pool level with small tables, and a view that stretched from the beach all the way to where the water met the sky in a line so clean it looked drawn. I'd ordered coffee and was working on the crossword from the morning paper, a meditative activity that Eleanor had introduced me to during the years when she was sick, and we'd spent a lot of time sitting together in rooms being quietly present for each other. I was on 17 across when I heard the footsteps. I didn't need to look up to know who they belonged to. There was a particular rhythm to Everett Sterling's walk, measured deliberate, the gait of a man who moved through the world, as though it had been arranged for his convenience. I'd noticed it the first time I met him, and it had never changed. He pulled out the chair across from me without asking, and sat down. "Garrison," he said, "I think it's time we spoke plainly." I set down my pen and looked at him. He was wearing pressed chinos and a polo that probably cost $200. And he was carrying the expression of a man who had decided he was going to take control of a situation that had been getting away from him for 3 days. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. He had clearly rehearsed this. "All right," I said. "The way you've been conducting yourself on this trip?" He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, the posture of a man making a boardroom point. "Pulling the room arrangements, the restaurant billing, the watch situation last night. It's causing significant distress to everyone. To Briar, to Chase, to Linda. I understand you feel you've been slighted in some way, but this behavior is..." "Everett." My voice came out level and unhurried. "Before you finish that sentence, I reached into the leather portfolio I'd brought from the penthouse that morning. The night before, I'd called Frank Bellamy and asked him to pull the key documents from my file and send them as PDFs, the property deed, the lease summaries, the account transaction history. I'd printed them at the resort's business center at 7 a.m., organized them the way I used to organize contract documentation before a project review, and slid them into a folder I'd bought at the gift shop for $4. I set it on the table between us and opened it. "Take a look at that," I said. He looked at me for a moment, calculating, trying to determine whether to engage with whatever this was or maintain his rhetorical momentum. Then he looked down at the folder. The first page was a property summary for the house on Birchwood Drive in Charlotte, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a backyard that Briar had described to her friends as a family heirloom. The deed was in my name. The mortgage current balance and payment history were mine. The down payment, $140,000 paid in full at closing 7 years ago, had come from my retirement savings. I had a highlighted line showing the transfer. Everett's eyes moved across the page. His expression didn't change, but his jaw released a fraction of tension, the involuntary tell of a man whose confidence was quietly recalibrating. The second page covered the vehicle leases. 2 of them, a Mercedes GLE and an Audi Q7, both in Chase's name, but both billed to my supplementary account. Combined monthly payments, $2,340. Duration, 4 years running. Everett turned the page himself this time. His movements had slowed. The third page was a summary of the Sterling family's last 3 vacations: Napa Valley, Scottsdale, and now Hawaii. Resort costs, flight upgrades, dining charges, activity bookings. The total across all 3 highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the page, $62,418. Paid from my accounts. The fourth page covered Chase's office space, a downtown Charlotte suite he leased for his consulting business. The down payment on which had come from a transfer I'd made 38 months ago, that Chase had described at the time as a temporary bridge loan and had never mentioned again. Everett turned that page slowly. His face had changed. Now the boardroom confidence was gone, replaced by something I had not expected to see there. Not anger, not defensiveness, but a genuine unguarded shock that made him look for just a moment considerably older than 70. His hand on the folder was still. "I didn't know," he said. The words came out stripped of performance, no inflection, no framing, just the bare fact of them. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the most honest thing you've said since we landed." He looked up at me. His eyes were doing something complicated, working through implications, reconfiguring assumptions that had been in place for 7 years, arriving at conclusions he didn't want to reach, but couldn't avoid. His lips parted and closed once without producing a word, which was the first time I had ever seen Everett Sterling unable to produce a word. "Oh, the watch," he said finally quietly. "Briar told me it was a family piece she wanted to share." "It was a family piece," I said. "My family. My wife wore it for 19 years. My wife who has been dead for 22 years, and whose things are not Briar's to distribute." Everett pressed his lips together. A muscle in his jaw moved, not the aggressive flex of before, but the smaller involuntary contraction of a man swallowing something that tasted bad. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words landed in the air between us with the weight of something that had cost him real effort to produce. I'd been building houses long enough to recognize genuine structural work when I saw it the kind that wasn't for appearances, but for actual load-bearing function. "I appreciate that," I said. He looked at the folder again, then back at me. "What do you intend to do with all of this?" "I'm already doing it," I said simply. "The cards are canceled. The room arrangements have been adjusted. When we get home, I'll be addressing the property and lease situation through my attorney." Everett absorbed that. His hand lifted from the folder, and he sat back in his chair, not the expansive, proprietary lean of the man who had arrived at this table, but the posture of someone who had been handed information that required genuine processing. "Briar doesn't know the extent of this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Briar has chosen not to know," I said. "There's a difference." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understood that distinction from his own experience, perhaps in ways neither of us needed to examine out loud. He stood up, straightening his polo with the automatic gesture of a man reassembling his presentation layer, and picked up his glass. "Garrison," he said. He looked at me with eyes that had lost their earlier combativeness and found something quieter in its place. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of respect, The kind that only came from having your assumptions thoroughly dismantled. I misjudged you. Most people do, I said. It's all right. He walked away. His pace was slower than it had been coming in. I watched him go, then looked back at the crossword. 17 across was still waiting, and the afternoon was still beautiful, and somewhere below me the sea turtles were probably still moving through the shallows, ancient and patient and completely unbothered. I picked up my pen and filled in 17 across. Then I turned to 18. The knock came at 7:15, softer than the night before, which told me something. Before I even reached the door, I'd been reading in the armchair by the balcony the evening version of the same ocean view I'd been watching all week, the one that kept offering itself up regardless of what was happening at ground level. I set my book face down on the arm of the chair, went to the door, and looked through the peephole. Briar stood in the hallway, in a linen sundress, her hair pulled back, simply her makeup minimal. She was holding a covered bowl with both hands, ceramic resort-issued steam visible at the edges of the lid. Her eyes were red-rimmed in the way that meant she'd been crying earlier, and had stopped long enough for the puffiness to settle in. Her lower lip was doing that small, involuntary trembling that I had been watching since she was 3 years old, and trying to hold something together. I opened the door. "Dad." Her voice came out careful, the way you carried something fragile across uneven ground. "I made this. From the market, and Maeve told me you liked the chicken soup from the vendor near the entrance." She held out the bowl slightly. "Can I come in?" I stepped back. She came in, set the bowl on the coffee table, and sat on the edge of the sofa with her hands folded in her lap. Not her usual posture, which ran to the expansive and territorial, but something smaller and more genuine. It was the way she'd sat when she was a teenager and had done something wrong and was trying to figure out whether to admit it. I sat across from her in the armchair. "I owe you an apology," she said. "More than one." Her voice cracked slightly on the second sentence, and she pressed her lips together hard to steady it. "The seat on the plane. The watch. The photo thing, the group chat." A sharp, pained breath through her nose. "I've been awful, Dad. I know I've been awful." My chest ached the way it always did when Briar was genuinely hurting, the specific pain of a parent that doesn't diminish no matter how much the child has done to earn their consequences. I looked at her red-rimmed eyes and her trembling lip and the bowl of soup she'd carried up 18 floors, and I felt every year of loving her sitting in my chest, like something too large for the space. "Briar," I said quietly. "I want to tell you something." She looked up, eyes bright with the hope that this was going to be the thing that resolved it, the thing I said, that let both of us breathe out. I had decided in the moment before she arrived to try one last thing. Not cruelty, clarity. I needed to know what was underneath the apology, whether it was me she'd come for or the money. "I've run out of money," I said. "The accounts are empty. I can't fund the rest of the trip." The hope in her eyes moved, shifted, reconfigured itself into something I watched with the attention of a man who needed to see clearly and hated what the clarity was showing him. "What?" Her voice went very flat, very fast. What do you mean, empty?" What I said. Empty. "I may need to borrow $500 to cover my expenses through the end of the week." 2 seconds. 3. I watched her face the way you watched a thermometer, the reading climbing degree by degree toward a temperature that told you what you needed to know. 500. She stopped. Her jaw tightened so fast I heard her teeth click together. Her hands, which had been folded softly in her lap, gripped each other hard enough that her knuckles went pale. "Are you serious right now?" The careful, gentle voice was entirely gone, replaced by something stripped and sharp and horribly familiar. "Are you actually telling me you're broke on this trip right now?" "I'm telling you I need help," I said. She stood up. Her hands flew apart. The bowl of soup on the coffee table, the one she'd carried from the market in Paya, the one she'd held with both hands in the hallway. She reached forward and picked it up, pulling it back toward herself with a proprietary snap that told me everything I'd been half hoping wasn't true. "Then what?" she said, her voice climbing hard and fast, breaking at the top like a wave hitting something immovable. "Have you been doing with 40 years of income? What was the point of all of it?" She was shaking now, not with grief, but with fury, the genuine unfiltered fury of someone whose safety net had just announced it had holes. "You're useless. You know that, completely useless." The word hit somewhere deep and old, a place that had been absorbing impact for decades and had grown scar tissue over the bruising but never quite healed underneath. My eyes burned just for a second, the involuntary response of a body that had not forgotten how to be hurt, even when the mind had decided to be clear-eyed about it. "Useless," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. She was already moving toward the door, soup bowl in hand, fury, carrying her forward the way anger always did for Briar. Fast, definitive, committed to its own momentum. "I can't believe this. I cannot believe this is what you've been doing with—" She stopped at the door, turned back, and the look on her face was one I had never seen directed at me before. Not frustration, not embarrassment, but a cold, flat contempt that she'd apparently been keeping somewhere I hadn't known to look. "Figure it out yourself." The door closed behind her. I sat in the armchair for a long moment. My eyes were still burning slightly. I let them burn because pretending it didn't hurt would have been a lie, and I was done lying to myself about the cost of things. I pressed both palms flat on my knees and breathed through it. In, out. The ocean outside kept moving. The room kept its own counsel. She hadn't asked if I was all right. She hadn't said she'd help me. She hadn't hesitated for a single second between hearing the word broke and becoming a different person entirely. What she had done was take the soup back. I picked up my phone from the side table and opened my contacts. My attorney's number was at the top. I'd moved it there 2 days ago, anticipating exactly this kind of evening. I pressed call and listened to it ring, my hand entirely steady, my mind entirely clear, the burning behind my eyes fading to something cooler and more permanent. When the voicemail answered, I left a message that was short and specific and covered everything that needed to happen next. Then I set the phone down and looked at the space on the coffee table where the soup bowl had been. The condensation ring it had left on the surface was already fading. By morning, it would be gone entirely. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the year Briar was 8 and had a fever of 103, and I'd driven 40 minutes through an ice storm at 2 in the morning to find a pharmacy that was open, and how I'd sat on the edge of her bed with the medicine and a glass of water. And she'd looked up at me with her sick child eyes and said, "Daddy, I knew you'd fix it." I had known in that moment that I would do absolutely anything for her. I still would. But anything had a shape, and its shape was not this. I was done being useless in the particular way that required me to be everything. I've signed a lot of contracts in my life. Purchase agreements, subcontractor deals, material supply orders, liability, waivers, insurance policies, partnership documents that took 3 attorneys to untangle when the partnership ended. I built a business out of paper as much as lumber and concrete. Learned early that the difference between a man who got taken and a man who didn't was usually the quality of his documentation and the clarity of his exit provisions. I thought about all of that as I sat at the desk in the penthouse at 11 o'clock at night, the ocean dark beyond the glass, the room lit only by the lamp on the desk and the glow of my laptop screen. My attorney, Frank Bellamy, called back at 11:14. He'd gotten my voicemail. "Garrett?" Frank's voice was the same at 11 p.m. as it was at 9 a.m. Measured precise, the voice of a man who had been practicing law in Charlotte for 30 years and had heard most things. "You want to walk me through this?" "2 vehicle leases," I said. "Both in Chase Sterling's name, both billing to my account. I want my financial obligation to them ended." I heard Frank's pen moving. "Both simultaneously. Both. Effective as soon as legally possible." In North Carolina, I couldn't unilaterally cancel a lease that stood in another man's name. Frank had been clear about that 18 months ago. What I could do was send formal written notice to the leasing companies that I was withdrawing as the funding party effective in 30 days and let Chase sort out his own financing from there. The leases were his responsibility the moment my payments stopped. 30 days meant Chase and Briar would need to find alternative arrangements by the time the new year arrived. "Send the withdrawal notices tonight if you can. I'll confirm in writing by morning." "Done," Frank said. "What else?" "The Birchwood property. I want the access codes changed on all entry points, front door, garage, gate. All of them." "I can have the property management company handle that first thing tomorrow morning," Frank said. "You want new codes issued only to you, only to me. And the property itself," I looked at the ocean through the glass, the dark expanse of it, the stars above the horizon line, the particular quality of Hawaiian night that made the sky look closer than it did at home. I had built that house on Birchwood Drive in the spring of 2001, the year Briar graduated from college. I had poured the foundation myself on a Saturday morning with 2 members of my crew who'd volunteered their weekend, and I had stood at the property line afterward with a cup of coffee and thought, this is for her. This is what I can give her. "Contact the realtor," I said. "I want a for sale sign on the lawn." A pause. Frank had known me a long time. "Garrett, you're sure?" "I'm sure." "All right." More pen movement. "I'll reach out to Sandra Marsh. She handled the property valuation last year when you were considering the refinance. She can have a sign posted within 24 hours and listing paperwork to you by end of week." "That's fine." "The proceeds from the sale, you want those directed to the new account we set up last month?" "Yes." "The separate account, the one with only my name on it, the one I'd opened quietly in October when I'd started understanding that the current arrangement had a shelf life." "Everything to that account." "Understood." Frank's voice was steady and professional, and entirely without judgment, which was one of the reasons I'd worked with him for 16 years. "Is there anything else tonight?" I looked down at my right hand, resting on the desk beside the laptop. The knuckles were rough from decades of work, the kind of hands that looked like what they were, which was the hands of a man who had built things. I had always been slightly self-conscious about them around the Sterlings. I wasn't anymore. "That covers it for tonight," I said. "I'll have everything confirmed in writing by 7 a.m. "I'll be at my desk," Frank said. "Get some sleep, Garrett." "I intend to," I said. After I hung up, I opened my laptop and drafted the written confirmations for each action, the lease terminations, the property access, changes, the realtor instruction. Clear specifics signed with my full name. I sent them at 11:47 p.m. and received auto-confirmations within minutes. Then I closed the laptop. I went to the nightstand, opened the small drawer, and took out the Rolex. I'd collected it from Dennis at the front desk that morning. The weight of it in my palm was so familiar, it felt like a handshake from someone I hadn't seen in years, solid, real, and entirely itself. I set it on top of the nightstand where I could see it. Not in the drawer, not hidden away. I set it on top of the nightstand where I could see it. Not in the drawer, not hidden away. She showed me tonight, L. I said quietly, to the empty room, to the ocean, to wherever she was. She showed me exactly what she'd been keeping behind the apologies. My throat tightened, but held. You would have seen it coming years earlier. You always did. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, the lamp warm beside me, the watch glinting on the nightstand, the sound of the Pacific, a low, continuous presence beyond the glass. Tomorrow was day 4, the last full day in Hawaii. I had planned nothing for it. No charters, no reservations, no arrangements that involved anyone else's comfort or anyone else's image. Just the day and the island and whatever I felt like doing with both of them. The thought settled in my chest, like something solid and well-made. The way a good foundation felt when you tested it, not exciting, not dramatic. Just sound. Just right. Just exactly what it was supposed to be finally, after a very long time of being asked to hold up more than its share. I turned off the lamp and lay back and listened to the ocean do what it had been doing for 10,000 years before I arrived, and would keep doing long after every problem I currently had was resolved or forgotten. I was asleep within 10 minutes. Best sleep of the trip. I woke on day 4 without an alarm, without a plan, and without a single obligation to another human being on this island. The feeling was so foreign, it took me a moment lying there in the half-dark to identify it. Then I did. It was freedom. Plain and simple and long overdue. I made coffee on the in-room machine, took it to the balcony, and watched the ocean for a full hour without checking my phone. The water was a deep, moving green this morning, different from yesterday's blue. The kind of color that reminded you the ocean was alive rather than decorative. I watched a frigate bird work the thermals above the water and felt something loosen in my chest that had been wound tight for longer than this trip. At 9, I went down for breakfast. I chose a table near the window, ordered the full spread eggs, fresh fruit, that excellent Kona coffee they served in a proper ceramic cup, and opened my book. I was on page 60 when Briar found me. She crossed the restaurant fast, her sandals slapping the tile, her face carrying the particular expression of someone who had received news that morning and had been building up pressure ever since. She stopped at my table and put both hands flat on the surface, leaning in. "You canceled the cars," she said. Her voice was low but shaking at the edges like a wire pulled too tight. "Chase got a call from the leasing company this morning. Both of them Dad. And the house, someone from the property management called to say the codes have been changed and there's a realtor coming to take photos tomorrow." I looked up from my book. "Good morning, Briar." Her face flushed a deep, painful red. "This is our home. You can't just, we live there, Dad. Our things are there. Where are we supposed to go?" "That's a conversation worth having," I said, "when you're ready to have it honestly." "Honestly?" Her voice cracked open on the word. Her eyes filled fast, tears spilling before she could stop them, tracking down her cheeks in 2 rapid lines. "I came to you last night. I apologized. I brought you soup, Dad, and you told me you were broke. Was that even true?" "No," I said. She stared at me. The tears kept falling, and she didn't wipe them either, too shocked or too exhausted to manage the performance of composure. "So you lied to me. See, I showed you something true," I said. "Your reaction did the rest." She pressed one hand over her mouth, the sob catching there and coming out muffled and raw, the sound of genuine hurt. Underneath all the anger, the child beneath the adult, the daughter beneath the stranger she'd been becoming. My heart pulled toward her with the particular agony of a father who loved his child completely and could not this time close the distance. "When you're ready to talk about us, not the house, not the cars, not the money, call me," I said. "I'll answer." She turned and walked away, one hand still over her mouth, shoulders shaking. I watched her go. Then I looked back at my book, found my page, and kept reading. The Kona coffee was as always exceptional. That evening, I ate the best dinner of the trip alone, a whole grilled fish the kitchen had caught that morning, a cold local beer, a slice of coconut cake I hadn't planned to order, and finished completely. I tipped 40% and meant every dollar of it. On the way back, I passed Chase sitting alone at the pool bar, no drink in front of him, phone face down on the bar top, staring at the water with the hollow expression of a man who had run his numbers and didn't like the total. I kept walking. Tomorrow we'd be on the same flight home. I already knew which seat was mine. Checkout morning has a particular feeling that no other morning quite replicates the sensation of a place releasing you, or maybe you releasing it. I packed slowly, folding things with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere to be for another 4 hours. I took one last look at the ocean from the penthouse window. All that blue, all that indifference, all that reliable magnificence, and carried something of it downstairs with me when I went. I tipped the housekeeping staff in cash, $20 each personally. The woman who'd been servicing the penthouse all week, a warm-faced woman named Rosa, who'd left a different flower on my pillow every morning, looked surprised, and then smiled so genuinely it reached the corners of her eyes. "You have a safe trip home, Mr. Vance," she said. I told her I intended to. My private car to the airport arrived at 10:15. I loaded my own bag, settled into the back seat, and watched Maui recede through the rear window with the particular mix of gratitude and readiness that marked a good trip properly concluded. At the airport, I moved through check-in and security, with the ease of a man traveling with one carry-on and no complications. Near the gate, I spotted the Sterling group, Chase at the counter, voice raised, arguing about checked bag fees that had apparently accumulated beyond what he'd budgeted for. Briar stood slightly behind him, sunglasses on despite being indoors, her jaw set in the rigid line of a woman holding herself together through sheer determination. Everett and Linda sat in gate chairs, their posture the stiff, upright dignity of people who had decided to perform composure for the duration. I walked past without stopping. On the plane, I turned left. Seat 1A was exactly as I'd left it, or rather exactly as it had always been. Window front left the best view and the most legroom, and the champagne already waiting in the cup holder when I settled in. The flight attendant appeared within 30 seconds. "Mr. Vance, welcome back. Can I get you anything before departure?" "Just this," I said, lifting the champagne flute slightly. "This is plenty." She smiled and moved on. I buckled my seatbelt, adjusted the headrest, and pulled out my book, page 62, right where I'd left it at breakfast. The boarding door closed. The safety demonstration began. The engines built their steady, purposeful rumble beneath the floor. I heard distantly the sounds of the economy cabin filling behind me, the overhead bins, the shuffling, the particular acoustic signature of a full flight settling in for a long journey. Somewhere back there in the vicinity of row 34, Chase and Briar were finding their middle seats in the last section. I didn't turn to check. The plane began to move. I looked out the window at the tarmac sliding past the terminal, receding the island, tilting away below us as we climbed. Maui from the air was extraordinary green and volcanic, and edged with that impossible blue, and I watched it until the clouds came between us, and I couldn't see it anymore. Then I opened my book, found page 62, and read. Simple as that. Clean as that. Mine as that. Home looked different from the car window, or maybe I looked at it differently. 31 years I'd pulled into that driveway, thinking about what needed fixing, what needed paying, what someone else needed from me. This time I just looked at the house. Just the house. And felt something unexpected settle in my chest. Relief, clean and quiet as fresh concrete. The realtor's sign was already in the lawn. Sandra worked fast. Chase's taxi had beaten mine by 10 minutes. I could tell from the way he was standing at the gate, fob in hand, punching the old code with increasing force, his shoulders climbing toward his ears with each failed attempt. Briar stood beside him, still in her travel clothes, her carry-on at her feet. She was staring at the cardboard boxes stacked neatly on the front steps. Her things, Chase's things, packed and handled by the property management team with the professional efficiency I'd requested. The rain started as my car pulled up. Light at first, then committed. I got out. Chase turned, saw me, and something in his face shifted. The performer dropping away, just a tired man in the rain, holding a key fob that didn't work anymore. He stepped back without a word and let me walk to the gate. Briar was on me before I reached it. Dad. Her voice broke completely, all composure gone, the rain already darkening her hair. Please, all of this over 3 minutes and a seat on a plane. I stood on my side of the iron gate and looked at my daughter, soaked, shaking her mascara, tracking in thin black lines down her face. Her hands gripping the gate bars with white-knuckled desperation. The seat wasn't the reason, I said. It was the confirmation. Confirmation of what? Her voice came out raw and cracked a sob, pushing through every word. That you've been sitting in my seat for 40 years. My money, my house, my sacrifices. Every time I got close, every time I needed something, even just to matter, you handed my place to someone else. I didn't know you felt that way. She was crying hard now, shoulders heaving rain and tears indistinguishable on her face. I know you didn't, I said, and my own throat pulled tight until the words had to push through one by one. That's the part that cost me the most. Her knees buckled. She didn't fall. She gripped the gate and held herself up, barely, her whole body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than this week. Deeper than Hawaii, from years of something she hadn't examined and now couldn't stop feeling all at once. Where am I supposed to go? She whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. My daughter, 42 years old, in the rain holding onto my gate. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about every morning I'd gotten up before sunrise so this woman could sleep safely. I thought about the look on her face when she pointed me to 34C. You're 42 years old, I said quietly. You are more capable than you've ever had to be because I never let you feel the weight of anything. Dad, I'm not done with you, Briar. I'm done being used by you. Those are two different things. I held her eyes through the iron bars. When you're ready to learn the difference, you know where I am. I turned and walked inside. The gate clicked shut behind me. The rain continued. I didn't look back. The house was quiet, in a way it hadn't been in years. Not empty quiet. Mine quiet. I sat in the living room armchair, the good one by the window, the one I'd always left for guests, and it fit me perfectly. I didn't know why I'd waited 31 years to sit in my own chair. Briar called 3 days later. Her voice was careful, at first rehearsed, and then it wasn't. Dad. Not about the house, not about the cars. Just, can we talk about us? My chest loosened just a fraction. I'm listening, I said. I didn't know I was doing it. Her voice cracked open, something raw pushing through. I know that's not an excuse, but I genuinely didn't understand what I was taking from you until it was gone. I know, I said. Are we going to be okay? I looked out the window at Sandra's sign still standing in the December light. We're going to find out, I said. That's the honest answer. She exhaled, shaky, real. Okay, Dad. Maeve came Saturday with coffee and boxes. We found Eleanor's photo box in the hall closet, and I sat down on the floor right there. Not planned, just necessary, with the box in my lap and 30 years of photographs between my hands. Eleanor at a job site in 1989, hard hat tilted, laughing at something off camera. Eleanor and me at the kitchen table of the first house we ever rented, both of us young enough that looking at the photo felt like looking at strangers we used to know. She would have hated that trip, Maeve said, settling beside me on the floor. I laughed, the real kind, from somewhere I hadn't accessed in years. She would have gotten off the plane at the gate. First class, Maeve said. First class, I agreed. I moved into my new place on the 20th of December, a 2-bedroom near the water in Belmont with a back porch that caught the evening light over the lake. Smaller than birchwood, entirely mine. The last thing I unpacked was the Rolex. I set it on the new nightstand and looked at it in the winter afternoon light. E+G 1987. New chapter L, I said quietly. We're long overdue. I put on my jacket, walked out to the back porch, and sat down in the chair I'd bought specifically for that spot. The lake was moving. The light was good. I had nowhere I needed to be, and no one I needed to manage. 68 years old, and the life in front of me was entirely, irrevocably mine. People ask me sometimes why I didn't fight sooner, why I absorbed it for 40 years before I finally set it down. Honestly, I thought love meant carrying everything without complaint. I confused sacrifice with worthiness, and I paid for that confusion with the best decades of my life. I believe God gives every man a moment of clarity. Mine came at 34,000 feet, holding a boarding pass with my own name on it, pointed toward the back of a plane I'd paid for. That moment was a gift, even if it didn't feel like one. These are the kinds of family drama revenge stories nobody plans to live. But if you're living one right now, if someone has been sitting in your seat for years, spending your money, taking your sacrifices for granted, don't wait 40 years the way I did. Set it down sooner. You are not a resource. You are a person. In family stories, revenge isn't the point. Reclaiming your dignity is. The seat on that plane was small. What it represented was everything. And I'll tell you, this family drama revenge isn't about hurting people back. It's about finally quietly choosing yourself. That's what family stories revenge actually looks like when it's done right, not loud, not cruel, just clear. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment and tell me what you'd have done differently. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because the next story is already waiting for you. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. And a small note before we continue: some upcoming stories contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and life lessons. If that's not the content you're looking for, no hard feelings, step away and find what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.